She sat on the narrow cot in the quiet sheltered dormitory, knees pulled close to her chest, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor as if it might give her an answer. Her sneakers were lined neatly beneath the bed, the laces tucked in the way she'd learned to do years ago when order was the only thing she could still control. The room smelled faintly of detergent and old books, and somewhere down the hall a radiator clicked in uneven bursts. A social worker stood in front of her, voice low, careful, like every word might break something fragile. "Your grandfather has been looking for you for years." The girl didn't respond at first. Her fingers tightened around the sleeve of her hoodie. Grandfather. The word felt distant, almost unreal, like it belonged to someone else's life. Then her eyes lifted, glassy but steady, and for a brief second, hope and fear crossed her face at the same time, because she didn't know which one she was supposed to feel. Across the country, in a marble office that echoed with quiet wealth, an elderly billionaire stood by a wall of glass overlooking the city he helped build. The afternoon sun reflected off polished surfaces, but nothing warmed him. His shoulders sagged as he stared at a ledger laid open on his desk, numbers highlighted, circled, questioned. His voice cracked when he finally spoke, not to anyone in particular, but to the empty room. Then where did the money go? It wasn't anger that filled the question. It was confusion. Loss. The kind that settles in when something precious disappears while you're certain you were watching it the whole time. How does a billionaire lose a child right under his nose? Before we go further, tell us where you're watching from, and stay with us, because this story doesn't unfold the way anyone expected. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And then if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, to understand how two lives so far apart could be tied together by one unanswered question, we have to rewind more than a decade earlier to a quieter time, before shelters and marble offices, back when the world still felt stable enough to trust. The girl's name, for now, was Emily. At least, that was the name written on her school notebooks, the one she answered to when teachers called roll. She grew up in a modest suburban house with beige siding and a maple tree out front that dropped leaves every fall without fail. Her mother, Laura, worked long hours at a medical billing office, coming home tired but trying to smile anyway. Emily remembered the smell of reheated pasta, the hum of the refrigerator at night, and the way her mother would sit on the edge of the bed and say, "Tomorrow will be easier," even when they both knew it probably wouldn't be. What Emily didn't know, at least not then, was that her grandfather, Richard, was one of the wealthiest men in the state. He had built a financial empire from the ground up, the kind of story business magazines loved to celebrate. But Richard rarely appeared in Emily's life. He sent birthday cards with crisp bills tucked inside, holiday gifts that arrived by courier, and the occasional stiff phone call that ended too quickly. Laura never spoke badly about him, but there was always a pause before she said his name, a hesitation that Emily learned not to question. Families have silences like that, spaces everyone agrees not to step into. And so life went on, quietly, predictably, until it didn't. The day everything shifted was unremarkable on the surface. Laura didn't come home on time. The clock ticked past 6, then 7. Emily microwaved leftovers herself, watching the door, listening for keys that never turned. By 9, the house felt too still. The phone rang once, and Emily jumped, heart racing. It was a hospital nurse, voice professional, words chosen carefully. There had been an accident. Laura didn't survive. The details blurred together after that, but Emily remembered the sound she made when the call ended, a small, broken noise that didn't sound like it came from her. If you've ever lost someone suddenly, you know that moment, when the world keeps going but your own life stops cold. What would you have done at that age, standing alone in a house that suddenly felt unfamiliar? In the weeks that followed, everything became paperwork and waiting rooms. Emily assumed, without really thinking about it, that her grandfather would step in. He was family. He had resources. Surely he would come. But days turned into weeks, and no one arrived. A distant cousin she barely knew took temporary custody, then decided it was too much. Emily was moved again, and then again, each transition explained with polite words that never addressed the real feeling underneath. She didn't belong anywhere. Somewhere along the way, her last name changed back to her mother's maiden name, a clerical decision that would later matter more than anyone realized. Files were misplaced. Calls went unanswered. And just like that, she slipped through the cracks of a system that assumed someone else was paying attention. Richard, meanwhile, believed Emily was safe. He had authorized a substantial trust meant to cover her care, education, everything she would need until adulthood. His advisors assured him it was handled. He was grieving too, in his own restrained way, and grief has a way of narrowing your focus. He returned to work, burying himself in meetings, trusting systems he had built his life on. When he asked about Emily, he was told she was settled. That word followed him for years, soothing and empty at the same time. He never imagined it could be wrong. Have you ever trusted something so completely that you never thought to check it twice? 6 years later, Emily was 15 and living in a sheltered dormitory, her world reduced to assigned beds and scheduled meals. She learned how to be quiet, how to disappear just enough to avoid trouble. At night, she sometimes replayed memories of her mother's voice, afraid they would fade if she didn't hold onto them tightly. She had stopped expecting miracles. That's why the social worker's words hit her so hard. Your grandfather has been looking for you for years. The sentence rearranged everything she thought she knew. If that was true, then someone had been lying. Or worse, someone had been careless. And suddenly, the question wasn't just where she belonged, but how she had been lost in the first place. When Emily and Richard finally met again, it wasn't cinematic. There were no dramatic embraces, no instant healing. Richard looked older than she remembered from photographs, his hands trembling slightly as he held a cup of untouched coffee. Emily sat across from him, studying his face, searching for familiarity. They spoke cautiously, sharing fragments, filling in gaps. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. The trust funds, the missing reports, the money that was supposed to follow Emily wherever she went. That was when Richard asked the question that had been haunting him, his voice breaking under the weight of it. Then where did the money go? The answer, when it came, was devastating, not just for what was taken, but for what it represented. Years of neglect hidden behind signatures and assumptions. The turning point wasn't the discovery of loss, but what came after. Richard didn't try to erase the past with wealth. He listened. He apologized, not once, but many times, knowing apologies don't rewrite childhoods. He funded reforms, demanded accountability, and made sure Emily had choices going forward, not obligations. Emily, for her part, didn't suddenly trust easily. Trust, she learned, is built slowly, like anything real. Over time, they found a rhythm, awkward but sincere. She went back to school. She laughed more. And one evening, as they sat quietly watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emily realized something unexpected. She wasn't defined by what she lost, but by what she survived. This story leaves us with uncomfortable questions. How many children are lost not because no one cares, but because everyone assumes someone else is watching? How often do we trust systems instead of people? And if you were in Emily's place, would you have held on to hope, or let it go to survive? As you reflect on her journey, ask yourself where you place your trust, and who might be slipping through unnoticed. Sometimes, the most important things don't disappear loudly. They fade quietly, unless someone chooses to look closely enough to find them again. Malcolm had built his life from nothing, the kind of story people admired from a distance without understanding the cost. He grew up watching his own father work until his hands ached, promising himself he'd give his family more than survival. By the time he was 40, he had succeeded beyond measure. Headlines called him visionary, interviews praised his discipline, and charities welcomed his checks with gratitude. But privately, Malcolm was a widower who ate dinner alone more often than not, sitting at the long table in a quiet house that echoed after sunset. His son, Daniel, had grown up around meetings and flights, bedtime stories replaced by notes left on kitchen counters. When Daniel died young, Malcolm carried a guilt no amount of success could soften. He replayed missed moments late at night, wondering how a man could provide everything except time. That regret became a promise to himself. If he couldn't fix the past, he would protect what remained of his family at all costs. That promise took form as a trust fund, carefully structured, reviewed by lawyers he trusted with his life's work. $2 million, set aside with intention, broken into monthly disbursements meant to cover education, healthcare, stability, and, as Malcolm phrased it quietly to his advisors, a life without fear. The documents were thorough, the language precise. There were safeguards, reporting requirements, scheduled reviews. Malcolm read every page before signing, his pen hovering for a moment longer than necessary, as if the ink itself carried weight. He believed systems worked when designed well, because they always had for him. On paper, everything looked perfect. There was no reason to question it. Each month, statements arrived neatly summarized, Balances adjusted as expected, confirmations filed away. Malcolm allowed himself to breathe easier, believing this was one thing he had finally done right. He entered the picture not as a disruption, but as reassurance. She was calm, organized, and unfailingly polite, the kind of person who remembered birthdays and wrote thank-you notes by hand. She had married Daniel years before his death, stepping into Malcolm's life quietly, never demanding space, but never absent either. He took responsibility for the trust's day-to-day oversight, sending regular updates that were concise and professional. Emily is enrolled. Emily is healthy. Emily is adjusting well. She never asked for more money, never hinted at struggle. Her emails ended with phrases like, "Everything is under control, and there's nothing to worry about." Malcolm appreciated that. After years of chaos and regret, order felt like mercy. On paper, everything looked perfect. There was no reason to question it. And yet, perfection has a way of hiding cracks. Months turned into years, and Malcolm noticed small things he couldn't quite name at first. Updates became shorter. Conversations shifted away from details. When he asked about visiting, there were delays, polite explanations about schedules and transitions. Nothing alarming, nothing concrete enough to confront. Malcolm told himself he was overthinking, that this was his guilt searching for problems where none existed. He returned to his routines, to boardrooms and galas, trusting that what mattered most was being handled. But somewhere beneath the polished reports and calm assurances, a quiet imbalance was growing, unnoticed because it didn't announce itself loudly. And that is where this story begins to change, because sometimes the most damaging failures are the ones that look flawless from a distance. Nia entered Malcolm's life quietly, almost invisibly, through what wasn't there. There were no photographs taped to refrigerators or framed on desks, no awkward school portraits mailed in stiff envelopes. Birthdays came and went marked only by calendar reminders and wire confirmations, gifts sent but never seen opened. When Malcolm asked why there were no pictures, the answer arrived gently, wrapped in understanding. "She's shy." When he suggested a video call, the reply was just as calm. "She doesn't like video calls." The explanations felt reasonable, even kind. Malcolm told himself he remembered being that age, wanting privacy, pulling inward after loss. He imagined Nia as a quiet presence somewhere out there, growing up at her own pace, protected from scrutiny. In that absence, he filled the gaps with assumptions that comforted him, never realizing how dangerous assumptions can be. When doubts surfaced, Malcolm met them with logic. Teenagers change, he reminded himself. Grief affects everyone differently. He didn't want to interfere, didn't want to be another adult forcing expectations onto a child who had already lost so much. His own regrets guided him. The memory of a son who grew up under pressure, always watched, always expected to perform. Malcolm believed distance could be a form of respect. Each time he hesitated, he told himself he was choosing patience over control, kindness over intrusion. The reports continued to arrive, neat and reassuring, reinforcing his belief that silence meant stability. On paper, everything still looked perfect. There was no reason to question it. But absence has a weight of its own. Over time, Malcolm noticed he was protecting an idea of Nia rather than a person. He defended her in conversations, brushing off casual questions with vague smiles. "She's doing fine," he'd say, and realize he didn't know what fine actually looked like. Still, he felt a growing sense of responsibility, a quiet need to shield her from harm, even though he had never heard her voice in years. It's strange how attachment can form without presence, how the mind fills in tenderness where information is missing. If you're listening, ask yourself this: how often have you trusted reassurance over evidence because it felt easier? The unanswered calls began subtly. A missed ring blamed on a busy afternoon, another on poor reception. By the third time, the silence lingered longer than it should have, stretching into hours that felt heavier than all the months before. Malcolm stared at his phone, the screen dimming in his hand, a familiar unease settling in his chest. He told himself not to panic, not to assume. But somewhere deep down, a truth he had avoided for years finally demanded attention. And then a call went unanswered for the third time. The doubts didn't arrive all at once. They came quietly, disguised as paperwork. A school name change between reports, explained away as a transfer for better support. Then it changed again the following year, this time without explanation. Replies that once arrived within hours now took days, always polite, always calm, always just a little too late. When Malcolm asked for a teacher's contact information, the response came back friendly but vague, saying the school preferred to communicate through guardians only. It sounded reasonable. It always sounded reasonable. Yet the details didn't line up the way they used to. Dates overlapped strangely. Milestones were mentioned but never described. Malcolm found himself rereading emails, not because they were alarming, but because they were empty. If you've ever sensed something was wrong without being able to prove it, you know how unsettling that feeling can be. Inside Malcolm, two voices argued constantly. One reminded him of his power, his wealth, how easily concern could be mistaken for control. He feared becoming that controlling rich man, the one who throws money and authority at every discomfort. The other voice was quieter but steadier, asking why instinct kept nudging him awake at night. Guilt complicated everything. He had already failed once by being distant, by trusting work over presence. Was questioning now an act of care, or just another attempt to ease his conscience? Trust told him to wait. Instinct told him time mattered. He remembered the promise he made after his son died, the one about protection, not perfection. And he wondered, painfully, whether avoiding discomfort had been easier than asking difficult questions. Malcolm began noticing how often explanations required him to stop thinking, how often reassurance depended on him staying silent. He replayed conversations in his head, searching for moments he should have pressed harder. Each memory carried a sharp edge. He told himself there was still no proof, no clear failure, nothing concrete enough to justify crossing boundaries he had respected for nearly 2 decades. But fear has a way of disguising itself as politeness. And guilt can convince you that restraint is virtue, even when it isn't. Ask yourself honestly, if this were your child, your grandchild, how long would reassurance be enough before you needed to see the truth with your own eyes? That question followed Malcolm late into the evening, lingering as the house settled into silence. He stood by the window, city lights flickering below, realizing that waiting had become its own kind of choice. For 18 years, he had trusted systems, documents, and distance. He had avoided one simple act because it felt invasive, because it felt like admitting doubt. And that's when Malcolm did something he had avoided for 18 years. Malcolm didn't announce his decision to anyone. He didn't argue, accuse, or demand explanations. He hired a private investigator quietly, the way people do when they're afraid of what they might find. The man was thorough, methodical, and careful with his words, someone who had learned that truth often arrives in fragments. He started where the records said Nia should be, calling the schools listed in the reports. One by one, they led nowhere. Some had no record of her enrollment. Others had closed years earlier. A few redirected him to administrative offices that never returned calls. It could have been clerical error. It could have been coincidence. But the pattern was hard to ignore. Dead ends have a sound to them, a dull finality that grows louder each time you hit one. Next came addresses. The investigator drove past quiet houses and empty lots, knocked on doors where new families answered with confused expressions. Nia's name meant nothing to them. Leases had expired. Forwarding addresses didn't exist. Each location told a story of someone who had passed through without leaving footprints. Phone numbers followed the same path. Disconnected tones. Automated messages. Lines that once belonged to someone and now belonged to no one at all. With every update, Malcolm felt something inside him tighten. He listened without interrupting, nodding even though no one could see him, as if staying calm might keep the world from tipping further out of balance. The first real break came not with evidence, but with honesty. The investigator paused longer than usual on one call, his voice lower, less certain. "I don't think she's where you think she is." The words landed heavier than any accusation could have. Malcolm closed his eyes, gripping the edge of his desk, the room suddenly too quiet. Years of trust, of deliberate distance, pressed in on him all at once. He wanted to ask what that meant, to demand specifics, but fear held him still. Because once you hear something like that, you can't unhear it. And part of him knew that the truth, whatever it was, had already been unfolding without his consent. As the investigation continued, the questions grew darker, though still unanswered. What kind of adult moves a child so completely that no official record follows? How does someone erase a life so neatly that it looks like nothing ever went wrong? The investigator found no signs of a struggle, no emergency reports, nothing that triggered alarms. Just absence layered over absence, supported by paperwork that looked legitimate until you looked too closely. Malcolm began to understand that this wasn't a single mistake, but a series of choices, each one small enough to ignore on its own. And somewhere in that realization, a deeper fear emerged, one that refused to be spoken aloud yet. Because if Nia wasn't where she was supposed to be, Then the question wasn't just how she disappeared, but how long she had been missing without anyone noticing. The investigator didn't tell Malcolm everything at once. He said there was a lead, a place where records didn't quite match, but people did. A shelter on the edge of the city, the kind most drivers passed without noticing, its hallway lit by fluorescent lights that hummed softly overhead. When Malcolm finally stood there, time seemed to slow in a way he hadn't felt since the day his son died. The air smelled faintly of soap and old paper. Thin blankets were folded along the walls, each one marking a space someone called their own. And then he saw her. Nia stood near the end of the hallway, posture straight, hands folded calmly in front of her as she listened to a staff member explain the evening schedule. She looked smaller than he imagined, older than her years, carrying herself with a quiet dignity that didn't ask for attention. What struck Malcolm first wasn't shock, but restraint. Nia said, "Thank you," often, softly, to everyone around her. She waited her turn. She held doors open. When asked how she was doing, she answered honestly but briefly, never adding details that might sound like complaint. She didn't cry when she realized who he was. She didn't raise her voice or ask why it took so long. She nodded, processing, as if she had learned long ago that emotions were safest when kept measured. Over tea that had gone lukewarm between them, she spoke carefully about school, about books she liked, about helping younger kids with homework. She never once asked about the money. Not once. And when Malcolm finally apologized, his voice breaking under the weight of years, she looked at him and said something that cut deeper than anger ever could. She said she thought she had been forgotten. That moment changed Malcolm forever. He understood then that loss isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the slow realization that no one is coming. Nia had built her strength around that belief, shaping herself into someone who needed little because asking had never worked. Malcolm listened, heart heavy, as she described moving from place to place, always told it was temporary, always believing it. She spoke without bitterness, without accusation, as if this was simply how life unfolded. Viewers listening now might feel the same tightening in their chest that Malcolm did, the instinct to protect, to rewind time, to ask how this could happen in plain sight. But here is where the truth began to sharpen. Because Malcolm hadn't forgotten her. Not for a single day. Someone had intercepted everything. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace or shout or demand answers. His anger arrived quietly, controlled, sharpened by clarity. The bank records were laid out in front of him in neat stacks. Each page a timeline he wished he had read sooner. Years of withdrawals, steady and consistent, aligned perfectly with the trust schedule. At first glance, they looked ordinary, almost responsible. But as the pages turned, patterns emerged. Lifestyle purchases that had nothing to do with education. Properties acquired and sold under unfamiliar entities. Private accounts that appeared, moved funds, then vanished. Each transaction carried a date, a signature, a justification that sounded reasonable if you didn't ask who benefited. Malcolm felt his jaw tighten, not in disbelief, but in recognition. This wasn't chaos. It was maintenance. When Malcolm finally spoke to Key, he kept his tone gentle, almost casual. He asked simple questions, the kind that didn't feel threatening. How long had Nia been out of that school? When was the last time she'd seen her? Which account covered medical expenses? He answered quickly, smoothly, as if she had rehearsed these conversations in her head long before they happened. Too quickly. Her words overlapped, correcting themselves mid-sentence, filling silence before it could settle. One answer contradicted a document. Another contradicted something she had said years earlier. Each time Malcolm nodded, letting her continue, watching the way certainty flickered just slightly when he asked for specifics. It wasn't the lies themselves that stood out. It was the ease with which they were offered. As the conversation ended, Malcolm returned to the records alone. He turned pages slowly now, feeling the weight of each one. There was a rhythm to the numbers, a story told without emotion. He reached the end of one stack, then another, until only a single page remained. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if it knew what waited there. Malcolm hesitated, fingers resting on the edge of the paper, understanding that whatever came next would confirm what he already feared. Then Malcolm reached the final page. The number stared back at Malcolm without decoration or apology. Over $2 million. Not misplaced, not mismanaged, but spent deliberately, steadily, over nearly 2 decades. The timeline was unmistakable. Month after month, year after year, funds intended for a child's education, healthcare, stability, a life without fear, redirected elsewhere with precision. Homes purchased and refinanced. Accounts opened quietly, then closed. Expenses justified with clean labels that masked their true purpose. This wasn't a single moment of weakness or desperation. It was consistency, planning, patience. The realization settled in slowly, heavy, and undeniable. Malcolm didn't speak. He didn't curse or slam his fist on the desk. He lowered himself into the chair behind him as if his legs had simply stopped cooperating, one hand bracing the armrest, the other covering his mouth. The room felt distant, like sound had been turned down. In that silence, the truth became clear. This wasn't theft. This was erasure. The legal response unfolded the way serious things often do, without drama, but with weight. Charges were filed methodically, each one grounded in records that spoke more clearly than testimony ever could. Accounts were frozen, properties flagged, access cut off with the same precision that had once allowed the damage to continue. Public exposure followed, not through spectacle, but through filings and headlines that laid out facts without commentary. There were statements, carefully worded, and apologies that arrived too late to matter. Malcolm watched all of it from a distance, not because he lacked interest, but because he understood something important. None of this would give Nia back the years she spent believing she was invisible. Justice moved forward as it should, calm and deliberate, restoring order to a system that had failed. Yet even as the process worked, Malcolm felt the quiet truth settle in. Accountability could explain what happened. It could punish wrongdoing, but it could not undo absence. Nia experienced the aftermath differently. She was informed gently, shielded from unnecessary details, allowed to ask questions when she was ready. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing the idea that someone would finally be held responsible. There was relief in that, but it didn't look like celebration. Healing rarely does. Malcolm noticed how she measured her reactions, how she nodded and thanked people even when the news was heavy. It reminded him that children learn early how to survive environments that don't protect them. He realized then that while justice satisfies the mind, it doesn't always reach the places where pain settles. So he focused on what came next, on consistency, on showing up without conditions. And as you listen to this part of the story, it's worth asking yourself something difficult. When harm is acknowledged and punished, what actually helps a child feel safe again? Because justice can close a case, but it doesn't always heal a heart. Malcolm didn't rush it. He didn't attempt grand gestures or extravagant promises. Their first real conversation happened quietly, over tea in a small, sunlit room, where words could be measured and heard. He spoke slowly, letting each sentence land. Apologies came without excuses, simple and raw, for distance, for assumptions, for trusting systems over presence. Nia listened, her expression guarded at first, then softening, a subtle shift that told Malcolm she was weighing each word, deciding whether to let him back in. There was no rush, no demand for instant forgiveness. Trust had to be earned, piece by piece, like rebuilding a home from foundation up. With that careful patience, the world around Nia began to feel different. Education was restored, supported by resources she could access herself, guided by her own interests rather than expectations. Safety became tangible, not just a promise, with stable housing, attentive caregivers, and the knowledge that she could reach out whenever needed. More importantly, Malcolm insisted on giving her choice, agency over her own life. Small decisions at first, then larger ones, teaching her that she was no longer at the mercy of others' agendas. Step by step, they began to reconnect, forming a bond built on respect, consistency, and acknowledgement of the years lost, slowly replacing absence with presence and fear with trust. The money mattered, but being seen mattered more. For Nia, the years of absence and silence could never be erased by wealth or accounts. What truly mattered was acknowledgement, presence, and the quiet assurance that someone had not forgotten her, that her life had value simply because she existed. Malcolm understood that fully now. Apologies and accountability were only the beginning. What healed wounds, even slowly, was being truly recognized, heard, and trusted. And now, the question lingers with all of us. If you were Malcolm, would you ever forgive yourself for trusting the wrong person, even if your intentions were pure? It's a question that cuts deeper than money, records, or legal victories, because it asks us to look at our own judgments, our own assumptions, and the fragility of human trust. If this story stayed with you, let us know below. And subscribe for more stories where truth eventually finds its way home.